Imagine you are born as a black slave, but one stranger, a white man, saves you, frees you and treats you like a human being, but he is killed in front of your eyes. What would you do? This is the story. The year is 1858 in Texas, America, a period where all the black people in the southern states were slaves and worked in cotton plantations. Two slave traders are seen transporting slaves on a cold night from Mississippi. The slave traders are on horseback while behind them is a line of 7 slaves walking bare feet on rocky ground with iron chains around their ankles. The slaves are shivering as they only have a small dirty rug covering their bodies. From the darkness, a well-spoken and well-dressed middle-aged bounty hunter disguised as a dentist emerged. He is looking for a slave purchased from Carucan Plantation, to help him identify 3 criminal brothers called the Brittle Brothers. This slave happens to be Django and the bounty hunter's name is Dr. Schultz. The bounty hunter engages in a very polite conversation with this slave Django, which did not sit well with the slave traders. Dr. Schultz politely offers to buy this slave, but instead, the slave trader points a gun at him and threatens to kill him. He does not take this threat lightly as he shoots one slave trader, killing him instantly. He shoots the horse of the other, causing the dead horse to fall, crush and trap the other slave trader below it, and just like that, the bounty hunter frees all the slaves. He releases all the other slaves but keeps Django with him. The two arrive at a whites-only town called Daughtry. The white residents are visibly shocked and stare at the two visitors as they pass through the streets as they have never seen a black person on a horse before. They enter into a bar, but when the bartender sees them, he runs out screaming for help from the town sheriff as there was a black person in his establishment which was forbidden. Suddenly, a crowd of people gather outside while the town sheriff and the bartender approach the front door. The sheriff moves back, stands in the middle of the street looking at the bar entrance. Django and Dr. Schultz walk outside to the front porch to meet the sheriff. Dr. Schultz extends his arm as if he wants to greet the sheriff, but instead, a small gun emerges from his sleeve and he proceeds to shoot the sheriff at point-blank range on the chest and on the head, killing him. Django, who is standing behind the bounty hunter, is visibly scared as the crowd screams while they run away. Django and Dr. Schultz retreat into the bar. The marshal and an army of armed cowboys form and take position ready to shoot, including snipers at the rooftop. After a brief negotiation, the two come out with their hands up. Dr. Schultz is holding a piece of paper which is a warranty to capture the sheriff dead or alive, as he was an outlaw who was hiding in the town under a different name when he was elected sheriff. The two leave the town on their way to Gatlinburg. Later on, as they are resting, Django tells Dr. Schultz that he plans to buy the freedom of his wife Broomhilda. He revealed that, after the two fell in love, they tried to escape in order to get married, but they were captured, and as punishment, they were branded with an R mark, a runaway slave mark, on their faces and sold cheaply and separately so as to never see each other again. Django is in deep pain as he narrates this story to the bounty hunter Dr. Schultz. The two continue with their journey and finally arrive in Gatlinburg where the Brittle brothers were hiding. Due to the presence of many plantations, they had to come up with a plan in order to remain safe, as the presence of a free black man riding on a horse would not be taken lightly. In the master plan, Django would play the role of a valet to Dr. Schultz. Django and Dr. Schultz ride their horse on a path surrounded by cotton plantations where black slaves are at work. The slaves also stare at the two as this is very unusual. They finally arrive at the house of the slave master and plantation owner, Bennett Manor, also known as Big Daddy. Big Daddy had a large number of black women between ages of 14 to 45 who he would sell as sex slaves. As expected, Big Daddy was not amused to see a black man riding a horse on his property. Dr. Schultz calmly explains the situation and confirms that they are there to buy one of the women slaves, which seems to relax Big Daddy. As Big Daddy was taking Dr. Schultz to show him the inventory, he instructed one of the slave girls to show Django around. Django took this opportunity to inquire on the whereabouts of the Brittle brothers. To their luck, the three were on this plantation under a different name. As soon as Django saw one of the brothers, he was hit with a painful flashback of the period they were torturing his love Broomhilda. They had tied ropes on her legs and arms and spread them out and whipped her mercilessly as he begged them to whip him instead, but they did not listen. The two had tried to escape but were caught. Whipping slaves seemed to be their favorite activity as they were in the process of whipping a poor girl for just breaking an egg. Django was consumed by anger as he approached the brothers. Taking his sweet revenge, he shot the eldest of the brothers before mercilessly whipping the other with a whip and finally shooting and killing him. The bounty hunter came and killed the third brother all in front of everybody. As expected, the white slave masters of Gatlinburg did not take this lightly. Killing of a white man by a black man is not something they could let go. So at nightfall, they dressed up as KKK clan members in pursuit of the two for vengeance. The vigilante group was led by Big Daddy as he was the richest in the town. This move was anticipated by Dr. Schultz and Django, who set up a trap for them. They placed dynamite inside Dr. Schultz's mobile dentist cart and a heap of clothes under it to fool the KKK members. Their plans worked perfectly as soon as the clan members surrounded the cart, it blew up, killing and wounding a majority of them. The survivors escaped except Big Daddy was sniped and shot down by Django. Dr. Schultz was so impressed by Django's skills that he offered to make Django an equal partner during the coming winter. In return, Dr. Schultz would help Django to find and free his lover Broomhilda. The idea of killing white men for money sounded very good to a former slave to white men. And that was the beginning of a great partnership as they went on to have a very successful bounty hunting duo. Winter came and went, and Django had kept his promise to Dr. Schultz, so it was his turn to return the favor. At the slave market in Mississippi, they learnt that Broomhilda had been sold to Candyland Plantation. Django was visibly in shock as Candyland was a known and feared place by the slaves due to its level of brutality. It was popularly known for Mandingo fights. These were fights to the death by the strongest enslaved black men for the entertainment of white people. Calvin J. Candy, the owner of Candyland, only dealt with trade of Mandingo fighters, so the possibility of selling Broomhilda to them were slim, and attacking and free Broomhilda was out of the picture as Candyland was too big for the duo to conquer. So, the only way to free Broomhilda was to outsmart him and set Broomhilda free legally. Their plan was that Django would play a Mandingo expert, and a black slaver, the most hated person by the enslaved Africans. They would request an audience with Calvin J. Candy, and when granted, they would offer to buy the third best fighter for a ridiculous amount of $12,000, an offer he could not refuse. Then later on, before the deal was finalized, Dr. Schultz would show interest to include Broomhilda in this deal, and due to the $12,000 offered, Calvin J. Candy would easily and cheaply sell her to them. As $12,000 is a lot of money which could take several days for transaction to actualize, they would escape with Broomhilda, cancel the $12,000 transaction and abandon the initial deal, hence freeing Django's lover legally. This was a good plan as they would keep both the money and free Broomhilda. The plan went as intended as Calvin J. Candy bought the offer and invited them to his plantation where the deal was to be finalized. On the way, the newly bought slaves showed Django deep resentment as they thought he was a black enslaver. Their first encounter with the brutality of Candyland was when this slave master ordered his dogs to maul one of the slaves to death for requesting an early retirement as a Mandingo fighter. Upon arrival, they were met by a house slave named Old Man Steve, who in spite of being a black slave himself, had deep hatred for black people. He was often more brutal than the slave master and was given authority as he had shown complete loyalty to his slave master. When Old Man Steve saw Django on a horse, he could not hide his spite and even went as far as to question his master because to him it was not right. Dr. Schultz asked for Broomhilda to be brought to him for his entertainment as slaves' consent was not needed. It turns out, Old Man Steve had put Broomhilda inside a hot box as punishment for trying to escape. This is a small hole in the ground, where runaway slaves would be thrown in, hungry, naked, and water would be poured on them periodically to increase the suffering. Broomhilda was to stay there for 10 days as per orders of Old Man Steve. As Broomhilda was being pulled from the hole, Django almost shed tears as the sight of his suffering lover felt too much for him to bear. Broomhilda got cleaned up, well clothed, and presented to Dr. Schultz for him to enjoy. She was scared as she had never met a white man who was not cruel to her. Once inside his room, Dr. Schultz was not cruel to her. In fact, as it was his character, he was quite polite to her. Django was hiding in the room waiting to see the love of his life. Django called out her name, and she turned back and saw him standing there. Broomhilda fainted, as she never thought his day would ever come. Later on that evening at the dinner table as they were discussing the deal, Broomhilda was in a good mood and constantly exchanged glances with Django. Old Man Steve saw this and suspected the two knew each other. In pursuit to humiliate Broomhilda, and to see Django's reaction, he tore Broomhilda's clothes off to reveal the lash marks on her back. Django almost lost it, and held his gun ready to go rampage. His anger confirmed Old Man Steve's suspicion, and as Dr. Schultz was about to introduce the offer to buy Broomhilda for $300, Old Man Steve interrupted and pulled Calvin J. Candy to the side. He explained that the two were only interested in buying Broomhilda and they would cancel the original deal before it was actualized. He felt as if the two were conning and wasting his time, which made him very angry. When he came back to the room, he had a small bag with him. Inside the bag was a skull. This skull belonged to a slave that had served his family in the past. He cut open the skull and revealed 3 dimples on the back side of the head, then went on a racist rant that the 3 dimples were associated with servility, which all black people had, hence why they served white people. He promised if he opened Django's head with a hammer, the 3 dimples would be present as a sign of his inferiority. Dr. Schultz and Django were scared. Angrily, he threatened to crush the skull of Broomhilda if a cash payment of $12,000 was not made immediately. Dr. Schultz paid the money and Broomhilda's freedom papers were processed and given to him. The good Dr. Schultz had no problem with the money, but the brutality he witnessed was too much for him. He remembered how the poor guy had been eaten by dogs as the white masters looked over and laughed. Everything seemed to go perfectly as despite of losing the $12,000, Broomhilda would be a free woman. She even had a smile on her face. As a sign to seal the deal, Calvin J. Candy wanted Dr. Schultz to shake his hands as it was the South's custom. At first Dr. Schultz refused the offer, but Jay Candy threatened to cancel the deal. His intention was to mock and belittle Dr. Schultz. Just like he did to the Sharif earlier on, Dr. Schultz extended his hand as if to shake Jay Candy's, but instead, a small gun emerged from his sleeve and he shot him dead. Gunfire and shooting erupted inside the room and Dr. Schultz was shot and killed. Django put up a respectable fight, but he was greatly outnumbered, and when Old Man Steve threatened to kill Broomhitta, he had no choice but to surrender. Just like that, Calvin J. Candy was dead, Dr. Schultz, the bounty hunter, was dead, Django Freeman was a slave again, and Broomhilda's dream of getting free and marrying Django was dead. After Django was caught, he was beaten, muzzled like a dog and hung naked upside down until morning. Old Man Steve and other slave masters debated on the best way to torture Django as death was too quick of a punishment. Some suggested to cut off his nuts and others wanted to whip him to death. Finally, a decision was made to give Django away to the LeQuint Dickey Mining Company. There, life would be horrific for Django as they would take away his name and give him a number. Then all day, every day, he would swing a sledgehammer turning big rocks to small rocks, and one word from him, they would cut off his tongue. He would be overworked and underfed until the day his back gave up. Then, they would hit him on the head with a hammer and throw away his body like a homeless dog. And that would be the story of Django. A perfect punishment. On the road to LeQuint Dickey Mining Company, other slaves were put on caged horse wagons, but Django was walking, being dragged by a horse from behind. Django tricked the slave traders with a promise of $11,000 bounty back at Candyland Plantation if they let him loose. Django was very convincing as he even had a wanted poster with this price. For this greedy men, this amount of money was something they could not let go. He was let loose and handed a gun, then proceeded to double-cross them and killed the 3 slave traders, took a horse and rode back to Candyland Plantation to get his wife. During this time, Calvin J. Candy funeral service was taking place, hence all the people in Candyland were distracted. Django was able to easily ride into the plantation where he found most of the white enslavers laying around lazily. He shot and killed all of them. He said his final goodbye to his old friend Dr. Schultz, and reunite with his lover Broomhitta. Django went to the big house where he waited for Old Man Steve and his white counterparts to come back from the funeral. When they did, he was able to shoot and kill all the white forks, but his real anger was with Old Man Steve, who acted like a black enslaver. Just killing Old Man Steve would be an easy escape to what he did to the slaves in Candyland, so he shot his kneecaps to immobilize him before setting a bomb and blowing the house to pieces with him still inside. Django and Broomhitta were finally able to ride off as free citizens. It turns out, attacking and conquering Candyland was the best action to take. Rumors has it that marked the beginning of the Civil War of 1860, but you did not hear that from me. Whether they made it safely to the north is a story for another day. Please like and subscribe for more.